We are formed by the families and the communities that we come from. As much as we may run from our heritage or try and deny our upbringing, whether we acknowledge the advantages we enjoyed with our family or whether we lament the lack of care and concern we received, it's right there. Those formative years create a life trajectory that we either blindly live into, passionately reject, self-destructively ignore, or integrate into the path that God lays out for us. Our passage today in our Stump the Preacher series is one that people in the Bible scholar world refer to as a text of terror. It isn't on anyone's regular preaching list. In fact, you wonder why Jephthah received more than a footnote from the writers of Judges. They could have left out this story if they'd wanted to. But no one is a simple character, even someone who fails and sins like Jephthah. We are formed by the families and communities we come from. Jephthah was a Gileadite. He was the son of his father by a prostitute. He had two half-brothers, the legitimate sons. And when his father died and it came time to probate the will, Jephthah was left empty-handed. Can you imagine what it was like growing up in that house as the illegitimate son? To have your birthday barely acknowledged while your brothers had friends over and balloons and presents and cakes adorned with candles, to be the older kid having to be positioned in the back of the family pictures for the cards that the family would send out. The misfit wears on you. When when Jephthah is left out of the inheritance, he flees his hometown. He begins to own this outsider identity, and he develops quite a violent reputation. It says earlier in Judges 11 that the outlaws collected around Jephthah and went raiding with him. Essentially, he forms a gang, makes his own family with his own rituals and traditions. If the established system of lineage and inheritance excludes you, make your own way. If the laws are skewed in such a way that you're left out, then ignore them and get whatever you can put your hands on by means of brute force and power. Jephthah's brutal reputation grows so much that when the Gileadites are fighting the Ammonites, they know they will not defeat them unless they go and ask the brutal Jephthah to come back and take over command of the army. None of their generals have panned out. And so Jephthah, the tacked-on son, the illegitimate boy, the one with no inheritance, seizes his opportunity. If you promise, he says, to make me head of Gilead, then I will come command your army against the Ammonites. That's where we pick up with our reading today. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah at this moment, as it does to all the judges. And there's some precedent for God's Spirit coming upon tricksters, murderers, outsiders. God has used such people in the past, so when we hear these words, the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah, we think perhaps here we'll hear a story of redemption. But then Jephthah makes his vow. Maybe it was made out of bravado, but I wonder if it was perhaps made in desperation. Jephthah sees how this victory could help him overcome the mockery and shame he's endured all his life. He would give anything to win this battle and legitimate his name among the Gileadites, to rub it in the face of his father, his brothers, the neighbors, the schoolyard bullies. Anything to win. So he promises to kill the first person he sees when he returns home victorious over the battle with the Ammonites. Offer this person up to God. Now pay attention. God has given Jephthah the Spirit of the Lord. Jephthah already has what he needs to carry out this mission and be victorious. But there's something about the man. He can't receive the Spirit of the Lord and trust it to be enough to carry him through. He can't put his faith in the promise from God and live in obedience to this promise, to this gift that God has given him. Those memories, that family history, the years of the betrayals and the years surrounded by his gang of outlaws, all of those stories have etched themselves onto Jephthah's heart. Because of what he has endured within his family, within his community, he cannot trust the promise from God. You heard the rest of the story. He wins the battle. The conquering hero comes home victorious. The doors of the house burst forth, and the first person to come out with her tambourine in her hand, dancing down the front steps, is his daughter. We get a detail here. She was his only child. He had no other son or daughter except her. You're supposed to think of another Bible story at this moment. Way back in Genesis, God gives a command to Abraham. God says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, offer him up as a sacrifice to the Lord. It's a troubling story, too, but at the last minute, God provides a ram for the sacrifice instead of the boy. And so Isaac's life is spared. Among the many interpretive lenses to read that story of Abraham and Isaac, one that we believe the Israelites drew from it was that this story teaches that the God of Israel does not need child sacrifice. Seems like a no-brainer to us, but it was common practice in the nations around Israel and throughout Mesopotamia to offer up children as sacrifices to their gods in order to receive harvests, blessings, victory in battle. But this story of Abraham and Isaac instructs the Israelites that God would never demand the life of a child in order to get God's care and provision. That's not how God works. The Isaac story is an example. The book of Leviticus says child sacrifice is wrong overtly. It says, any of the people of Israel or the aliens who reside in Israel who give any of their offspring to Molech, that's another god, shall be put to death. But Jephthah worries about what will happen if he breaks his vow to God. He won the victory. He made the promise. He needs to show his loyalty and his gratitude by keeping his oath, even though it violates the Torah, even though it contradicts the story of Abraham and Isaac, even though there are examples, in Exodus, for example, where God vows to kill the Israelites because God's so upset with them. Moses pleads with God, and God relents. So there's evidence that even God's oaths of death have been tempered by God's own mercy, because life in the covenant is not one based on threat, but one based on a word of life. So Jephthah can turn away from this vow. He can give it up. There's precedent, even from his own God, of doing such a thing. And God will not only accept Jephthah turning away from his vow, God will be grateful that Jephthah turns away from his vow. But Jephthah can't see it. And whatever he's taught his daughter about their God, she can't see it either, because she goes along with the vow that has been made. We're formed by the families and communities we come from. So she, the innocent one, suffers for the senselessness of her father. This innocent one suffers for the pride and sin that he carries out. This desperate desire Jephthah has to win the battle, to solidify his importance among the Gileadite people, to redeem his name as the son of a prostitute who was excommunicated from his family. A tradition builds around the death of Jephthah's daughter, 4 days, a lamentation, a warning about vows of pride and power-seeking that lead to the death of innocent people. A reminder, a lamentation to teach that winning isn't everything. It's quite a story for Father's Day. Quite a way to learn that winning isn't everything. Is there another way to learn this lesson without having to endure this traumatic tale of the wounded and proud Jephthah and the innocent and victimized daughter? Is there a way that we could learn not to be defined by the slights and the difficulties that we have endured in our families or in our communities and find another direction for our days? Is there a model to look to for what it means to live in such a way where winning isn't everything? Well, here's a shot. Father's Day in the United States coincides every year with the final round of the U.S. Open golf tournament. And the most impactful U.S. Open golf tournament I ever watched was in 1999 at Pinehurst No. 2 in North Carolina. The story of the week was the young golfer. He was young at the time. It was 22 years ago. Phil Mickelson was seeking to claim his first victory as a major champion. His wife, Amy, was pregnant with their first child. She hadn't been able to make the trip. And so the commentators were abuzz all week because Phil was wearing a pager. Remember, it's 1999. A pager, and had committed that if Amy paged him that she was in labor, he had a private jet at the airport. He was going to walk off the course, board the jet, and fly home to California to meet his firstborn child. Well, the Sunday round of the tournament came, and Phil Mickelson was in the final pairing of the U.S. Open, no baby yet. The golfer that he was paired up with, the other leader in that final round, was the eccentrically dressed Payne Stewart. Now, you need to know that in the 1990s, Tiger Woods bursts on the scene, golf explodes. I'm learning to play golf at this time. I know all the Tiger mania, but I have to confess that Payne Stewart was my favorite. I loved the knickers and the caps, his smooth swing, his sense of humor. For the purpose of the story today, you need to know that Payne Stewart was also the father of 2 young children at this time. It was a 2-man show in the final round, back and forth, Phil and Stewart, hole after hole in the mist, on a misty day at Pinehurst. Questions kept rising throughout the round. Would Phil's pager go off? Would he win his first major tournament? Would Stewart win his second U.S. Open? And they get all the way to the final hole, and Payne Stewart has a 20-foot putt to win the U.S. Open. See it? Stewart sinks the putt, punches the air with his fist. He runs and celebrates with his caddy. And there, amidst the roar of the crowd cheering his name as the champion of our nation's highest major golf tournament at one of the hardest courses in the entire world, in a moment that could be all about his own glory, his own power, his own ability, he goes over to speak to his competitor, to shake his hand, and he takes Phil Mickelson's face in his hands. He looks him square in the eye, and he says, "You're going to be a father." That's somebody who knows that there are some things more important than winning. Now, how is it that Payne Stewart knew that when Jephthah didn't? What could you see in that shot? As Stewart took Mickelson's face in his hands, he's wearing a small bracelet on his right wrist. It had 4 letters sewn into the fabric. WWJD. Those of you who were old enough in the 1990s, do you remember those? They were bracelets that people wore around to remind them, what would Jesus do? And if someone knows Jesus, and if his life lives in them, then they know for sure that there are some things in life more important than winning, more important than making a name for myself. Jesus spent his entire life showing anybody who would watch, telling anybody who would listen, what mattered most in the world to God. And Jesus welcomed little children who were supposed to be worthless. Jesus visited with prostitutes, the most debased. He ate in the homes of the traitor tax collectors. He touched the dirty lepers. He kept exposing the innocent sufferers of the society around them. He kept showing in his day those daughters of Jephthah who suffered innocently because of the pain and the pride of the powerful. Jesus did so much to expose that suffering and that pain, so much to remind people what was the most important thing, what was much more important than winning, that he himself was crucified. He became the innocent sufferer. He became the loser who fell at the hands of the powerful winners. His death on the cross exposes human pride, this willingness to promote ourselves, to preserve our station at the expense of the life of another. His death on the cross displays the depth of human pain in our souls that will allow us to hurt another person in order to make ourselves feel better. His willingness to die showed that the preservation of innocent life is more important than any victory, more important than redeeming our name, more important than any kind of power or glory we could ever achieve. And his resurrection is a declaration that we find our true identity and worth in him. That his is the ultimate authority and way, and that we have been enveloped into that way ourselves. We no longer have to be defined by whatever difficult childhoods we had to endure or whatever community ridicule we received. We have an identity that is in Jesus. We know ourselves in him, and so his mission becomes ours. We no longer have to make vows that are ridiculous in order to prove our honor. Instead, we can take our opponent's face in our hands and remind them that there is something in life far more important and winning. So may we be the body of Christ, carrying out the ongoing mission of Jesus, remembering that no glory can surpass the glory of the one who died and rose, so that we, full of his grace, might live in such a way that we honor every human life before we would ever seek our own personal gain. And when we live in that way, we will discover what a true victory is.